For my AP research project, I decided to research the effect of a volleyball set on offensive decision-making in high school girls volleyball. First, it is crucial to acknowledge the importance of this research. Volleyball, like other sports, is complex and requires players to make multiple decisions within short periods of time. On offense, players have various types of attacks at their disposal, so it is significant for researchers to observe which factors during games lead to the most successful types of attacks in order to find the best ways to train players for game situations. It has been found that the quality of sets are one of the biggest factors that determine the choices of hitters. Therefore, the extent of how sets influence offensive decision-making will be the focus of the study. According to Shaw et al., there is a physical difference between high school players and professional players, which means that conditioning high school players for varying game scenarios is crucial to their preparation for professional volleyball. Therefore, it is significant to study the various types of sets and attacks that high school players utilize in games. Before proceeding, it is important to understand some concepts and terminology of volleyball. Hitters can be any player that hits the ball into the other court, but are typically the ones that are closer to the net. An attack is what the hitters perform on offense as either a hit, tip, or push. A hit is forcefully swinging at the ball into the other court. A tip is using one hand to lightly tap the ball around the block. A push is using two hands to forcefully push the ball into a targeted area strategically to avoid a block. A set is pushing the ball into the air for other teammates to use to attack. Zone 4 is the top left of the court, aka outside hitter position. Zone 2 is the top right of the court, aka setter's position. In the game of volleyball, teams win points whenever the ball hits the floor on the opposite court. Players have strategies for winning points either by serving or attacking while on offense. During the game, each team has a setter who remains in Zone 2 and sets the ball to hitters. For example, a hitter in Zone 4 who will either hit, tip, or push the ball over the net and aim for a place in the other court that an opposing player cannot get to. Lastly, tempo is the timing between the set and the attack is made. Different tempos can be used to perform different types of attacks, which will be further described later on. Previously, research has been conducted on how decision-making in volleyball, including the factors of serve-receive, setter's choice, and blocking. However, there has not been research done on decision-making in offense, which is crucial to the game of volleyball because most points are won on offense. Also, these studies focused on college and professional volleyball. Therefore, there has been a lack of studies on decision-making in high school level volleyball, which is as significant because improving high school athletes affects their performance later on when they become professional players. For this reason, I have decided to study to what extent does a volleyball set influence the decision-making for the type of attack a player executes in terms of tipping, pushing, or hitting, specifically in high school girls volleyball. In particular, I will be studying the different success rates of three types of sets: shoot tempo, fourth tempo, and fifth tempo. The types of sets that will be examined in the study are for the outside position, which will be one low tempo, medium tempo, and high tempo, depending on the height and speed of the set. Tempos all have set different names, all correlating to the timing of when the ball leaves the setter's hands to when the ball is hit by the player. For example, a 1 or first tempo is a set that is barely above the net and is set right as the hitter swings their arms. Here are shoots, which is a high-speed set similar to first tempo, 4 and 5. Other researchers have previously studied decision-making of players in volleyball, specifically when they receive a serve. In a study by Barsingerhorn et al., experienced players were individually tested, had to cover a certain distance, and were required to receive a serve and pass the ball to a target, either by underhand passing, which is when they use their arms as platforms, or overhead passing, which is when they use their hands to pass. The study that found that when players perceived the action of overhead passing to be impossible, meaning the distance they had to cover was too large or the ball was below their waist, they chose to use underhand passing. On the other hand, there have been studies that observe offensive decision-making in men and women's professional volleyball. In a study that analyzed Zone 4 attacks in men's Super League games, Costa et al. Were able to determine that out of the multiple factors that influence the efficiency of these attacks, including serve reception, tempo, and type of attack, the tempo of the attack was a leading predictor of the success of the Zone 4 attacks. The researchers found that the second tempo of attack yielded the most points, which correlates with another study that found that slower attack tempos afford a hitter more time to prepare and create momentum for performing the action. This evidence was also found in a study by Afonso et al. That analyzed women's championship games, which observed that the second tempo yielded the most successful hits because attackers are given enough time to make a smart offensive decision. However, all previous studies analyzing offense in volleyball are conducted using professional and adult players, and therefore are able to assume that those hitters are able to hit through a block or perform strategic quick attacks regularly, while at a high school level, players would not be able to do this because of their lack in height, muscle mass, and professional training. Research has shown that this directly affects the quality of their attacks because of inferior vertical jump and lower body power, according to Schall et al. Therefore, high school players must compensate for not being able to do certain types of hits by tipping or pushing to get around a block. Hence, factors that influence decision-making on offense must be studied in order to determine which sets yield the highest efficiency so that they can be trained to make successful decisions in game situations. I hypothesized that different types of sets would yield different types of attacks, as sets can vary in height, speed, and tempo. The higher the tempo, the more likely an attack was successful in terms of avoiding a block and hitting the ball in a targeted area, because higher and slower sets give the hitter more time to decide which action will be more successful, according to Costa et al. My method of inquiry was an experimental approach that attempted to explain the correlation between the quality of sets and the success of attacks in high school volleyball. For my quantitative data, I used primary source research, as I conducted my own experiment involving a selection of high school girls volleyball players as the participants for the study. I used a standard volleyball court in an indoors gym, and I used 14 experienced volleyball players, 13 of which came from Immaculata High School. The remainder came from surrounding schools, and I chose to only include high school participants because of the physical differences between high school and college players. I gave each of the participants a brief survey asking for certain background information, as I wanted to limit my participants to have varsity experience so as to not influence the data of the experiment. Previous to the study, I designated 2 participants to be the setters for the experiment and gave them separate instructions that they did not share with the rest of the subjects. I also simulated a block using a blocker, which the hitters had to avoid during the drill. The other participants' task was to perform an attack, starting their position from Zone 4 after they were given a set by the designated setter, who would remain in Zone 2. Each subject performed an attack, then moved to the back of the rotating line and made a total of 5 attacks per round. There were 3 rounds. The first round, the participants had the goal of successfully hitting the ball into the other court. The second round, they had the goal of pushing or tipping the ball into the respective designated areas in the other court. And the third round, they chose whichever action they preferred. The setters were required to perform different types of sets each round at random without telling the hitters, alternating between a shoot set, 4th tempo, and 5th tempo. The purpose of the variety in sets was to find the correlation between the types of sets and offensive decisions that the participants made in round 3, as well as correlation with the success of their attacks in the first 2 rounds. The goal of this method was to determine an ideal specific type of set that yields the greatest amount of successful attacks. After the study, I watched over the film and calculated the correlation between the types of sets and the success of each attack under each tempo. This chart represents the total amount of each attack attempted under each tempo for all 3 rounds. It can be observed that under the shoot tempo, more tips and pushes were cumulatively chosen as opposed to hits, as there were 35 placed attacks and only 27 hits. However, under the 4th tempo, the results showed that there were 35 hits and only 30 placed attacks, exemplifying how the participants began to prefer hits over tips and pushes under a higher tempo. Finally, under the 5th tempo, hits dominated placed attacks, confirming the previous idea that higher tempo yielded more hits. The next figure represents the success rate for each attack type under each tempo throughout all rounds. It is significant to acknowledge the cumulative success rates of each of the tempos, with the fifth tempo at the highest success rate, followed by the shoot tempo, and then the fourth tempo, since the original hypothesis predicted that higher tempos would yield higher success rates. Evident in the data shown in Chart 1, more attempts at tipping and pushing under the shoot tempo overall were more prevalent than attempts at hitting. Similarly, in the third round, when participants were able to choose which attack to perform, tips or pushes were more frequently chosen under the shoot tempo than hits. This supports my hypothesis, which stated that set tempo would be the leading factor for the participants' offensive decisions in whether they would choose to hit or tip or push. Therefore, it can be deduced that high school girls volleyball players believe that tipping or pushing under faster tempos lead to less risk, as opposed to hitting, in terms of their attack being unsuccessful. With respect to attack tempo, the findings of my research indicate that collectively, the fifth tempo yielded the highest cumulative success rate of attacks, in comparison to the cumulative success rates of the shoot and fourth tempo, which can be seen in Chart 2. This confirms my hypothesis that the highest tempo would yield more successful attacks, as slower tempos of attacks allow the hitter more time to prepare and create more momentum for their attack, which in a game situation would allow them to either break through or avoid a block if hitting, or find an opening in the other team's defense to do a placed attack through a tip or push. The findings of my research can have important implications, including a better understanding of what yields successful attacks in game situations, leading to better training of high school and professional athletes, therefore improving their performance. While I conducted that my hypothesis was true, there are a number of limitations to my findings. First, it is important to acknowledge the limited variety of participants. Although my number of participants was substantial, this sample size taken from one small private school may have caused the data to become heavily influenced by similarities in the participants' training. Therefore, the results of this experiment may be different if done with a larger or more experienced group. Additionally, I had to repeat the study and conducted it a total of 3 times in order to include the rest of my participants, which may have influenced my data as the setters were not consistent for all 3 of the sessions. The results of this study have the potential to inspire further inquiry into offensive decision-making in high school girls volleyball, specifically for the purpose of training players to utilize strategies that will lead to higher success rates during games. There are several future studies that could be conducted to increase the understanding of how varying set tempos are a major factor for a player's offensive techniques. As mentioned, I would recommend a larger and more consistent sample size to obtain more accurate information. While my study only focused on how quicker tempos result in placed attacks such as tips or pushes, further research could be conducted on the progressive success rates of tempo hits throughout a season, as such moves require practice coordination between hitters, and setters. While the success rate of a hit under a shoot tempo may be low for the first experiment, the success rate could potentially increase after weeks of practice, which could be significant for improving players' performance during games for high school to professional volleyball. On the other hand, other implications from our research can be useful information for studying creating game strategies which alternate between higher and lower set tempos to confuse the opposing team and create holes in their defense. Ultimately, interpreting the varying elements that determine the success of an attack, such as the tempo of a set and various other factors, would greatly help researchers and players understand how these variables affect players' offensive decision-making in high school girls volleyball. Thank you.